So even though you do some of it in the mornings, we look forward to a time this Saturday. Okay. Ken Jean says we're too loud. So are we okay? Whatever. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. That's as far as I can go. 1, 2, 3. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, 14, and 20. Okay. I know my numbers, I just can't get them in order. All right. Again, it's just so good to have you. You're such an encouragement in these times to see you and to be with you. But as I was saying, as many as can, we would love to have you for the social on a Saturday. And again, if something comes up, you can come, and you feel uncomfortable, let Jim or myself know, and we'll make arrangements to pick you up and deliver you, get you back home. Okay? All right, we're winding down. Yes, Ken?
If you're too loud, I haven't been to school on that button yet.
Okay. With my hearing problem, I don't know whether I'm soft or loud. That's probably too soft. Okay, all right. We're winding down in our study of Acts. And somebody's already asked me, and I don't know whether they mean get through real quick or what they meant, but are we ready to go into the next lesson? But we'll look at chapter 27 today, and then 28 next week, the Lord willing. And then we'll go into the book of Galatians. One thing, I know that specifically we all have issues in our life that just takes our thinking. It's with us day in, day out, some specific issues that we go through. But in a general way, this pandemic has affected everybody, not just locally, but worldwide. It has affected people, some of you, don't know about you specifically, but some in our class have actually had it. We probably all know somebody, either family or friends or neighbors that have had it. So it is affecting us. We can't visit in the hospital, for instance. We have distancing. We all came in here with these wonderful masks. So we're all affected in a very negative way where something has been sent our way. It's my strong opinion that it has been, if not sent, it's been allowed by God to try to get our attention. We are a world and we are a nation that is out of control. We need to repent, but I see no signs of repentance. So we're all affected. If you go beyond this, just in the past year, in a more localized situation, there have been, especially on the West Coast, many people affected with wildfires. Those fires have destroyed many homes as well as vegetation, taking some lives. Hurricanes, more than one, has swept through the Gulf Coast. Flooding, more destruction, on and on. Tornadoes, more destruction everywhere you look. All these things seem to be shall we say, a common occurrence. It's getting to be more common as days go on. And by the way, this is just a side note. Some people have said, hurricanes, earthquakes, these sort of things, we've always had them. But if we're looking at the end days, we see the frequency of these things being much more frequent, more severe. It's like birth pains, as Jesus said in Matthew 24. they are birth pains which get more severe and closer together as you see that great day of the second coming to pass. Now, that was a side note, back to where we're talking about. We have all been affected by some degree, and many of us with a great degree, with the suffering, the negative things that have come into our life. Notice that these tragedies, these negative things, didn't just happen to bad people. They happened to young and old, Christians and non-Christians. Happens to us all, something that we all have to go through. So with that in the background of our mind, we'll look at this chapter 27. We'll deal with it in a different way. Usually we go through verse by verse and see what we can pick up out of each specific verse. But rather than this time, we want to go through the whole chapter, and I like to read the whole thing because it's not what I say, it's what God says. So we'll put the scripture in front of us. We'll go through the whole chapter, and then we will look back and see what kind of spiritual lessons that the Lord would have us and would be sharing with us. Two or three things just in the back of our mind as we go through this. Number one, the last part of Acts has been about the apostle and the missionary Paul. So let's watch him. What's happening to him? Why is it happening? Where's God in the things that happen to him? How does he respond? Watch for those things. We begin by saying that Paul is he's under arrest, actually. He's on his way to Rome, but he's in the care of Julius, a Roman centurion. Notice Julius's attitude toward Paul as he sees Paul going through these things. Watch his attitude. And of course, we'll just be thinking about what one word would you use to describe what's happening in chapter 27? If you had to summarize it and put it all in one word, what would that be? And then we'll discuss that on the other end when we get through with it. Okay? So, having said all that, let's look at Acts chapter 27. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. This pause a little bit as we go through here. Sounds like Luke is back with Paul and he's accompanying him on the journey, probably at his own expense, but to accompany him as he went. Julius, a Roman official of one of the highest orders of the soldiers and so forth. So Julius is taking Paul along with some other prisoners on the way to Rome. Verse 2, and embarking in Adramyttium, and by the way, you are free to call these names anything you want to. I don't know, so you call them whatever you want to call them. And embarking in an Adramyttian ship, which was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. In other words, there was another Christian on board, again accompanying Paul. I think this is something else. Paul was not left by his closest friend to suffer alone. Luke is with him. Aristarchus is with him. Verse 3. The next day we put in Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. Interesting that along the way, other Christians are along the way, some that knew Paul. So he was allowed to visit with his friends as he went. 4, from there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. When we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra and Lycia. And there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. When we had sailed slowly for a good many days and with difficulty had arrived off Cnidus, since the wind did not permit us to go farther, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone. And with difficulty sailing past it, we came to a place called Fair Havens, which was the city of Lasea. Just notice as we're going through here, number one, we're finally on the way to Rome. If you go back maybe a couple of chapters, back in 24, 27, number one, Paul has had a visit from the Lord saying, I'm not through with you. I want you to go to Rome and minister there. 2 years have been spent where Paul is just sitting around doing nothing. Well, I won't say doing nothing, he was active, but 2-year delay in accomplishing what God had intended. So finally, he's on a ship, getting ready, and he's going to Rome. Just a little side note, some of us pray for things, and then we get agitated because they don't happen the next day or the same day or whatever. Paul has the promise of God that he will go to Rome. For 2 years, Paul saw no evidence of it. There might be a little side issue here in teaching us something about patience. And God is in control. He knows what he's doing. He's not tied to a clock or a timepiece like you and I are. He's working it out. He's working it out on his schedule and in his time. Now, we see that on the way to Rome, he's on a ship, and the ship is having difficulty. It is not smooth sailing, and I'll just leave it there for a minute, but just keep that in the back of the mind. Yes, Paul is in God's will. Things are happening under God's control, but there are difficult times. Things are happening that are not easy. So we pick up again in verse 9. When considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them and said to them, Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul. Because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there if somehow they might reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. And when a moderate south wind came up, supposing that they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete, along shore or close by. Notice again, Paul has a word from the Lord. He knows that he's in God's will, and he is the one saying, Men, I don't think this is a safe thing to do. The centurion, who is the officer in charge, is listening to the captain, which I think is pure logical and a thing to do. The captain of the ship, who's in charge of the ship, the merchandise that he's carrying, et cetera, the experienced one on the ocean. Paul was not a sailor per se. So the centurion is listening to the captain, overriding Paul and saying, let's press ahead. I'm with the captain. The captain and the others are saying, let's proceed. So the captain's influence, the centurion's agreement, Paul's disagreement, but evidently said his piece and is now keeping his mouth shut. And then we're going on, picking up again in verse 14. Before very long, there rushed down from the land a violent wind called Euraquilo. We would call it a northwester or a nor'wester, a strong wind. And when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and let ourselves be driven along. Running under the shelter of a small island called Claudia, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. After they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables and undergirding the ship, and fearing that we might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor and in that way let themselves be driven along. The next day, as we were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands, since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us. From then on, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. This is a dangerous trip. It's dangerous. They should have known. They have put out in, we read that they put out after a day of the Atonement, which was a Jewish festival. It kind of marked a time on the calendar. This is the end of fall, the end of good sailing weather. From now on, it's wintertime, and it's safest to find a good harbor, settle yourself down. This isn't like ships of today. Settle down, wait it out, and in the spring, and we don't even think in those terms, patiently waiting that long, but in the spring, resume your voyage. So they're under this thing. They have gone along with the captain's influence. Think we can make it, let's go. So indeed they do. But now they're in the midst of a storm, and this would not have been an ordinary storm. I've never been in a storm. Well, let's see, a cruise ship. Bobby's nodding her head. Cruise ship. It was a storm, I guess, but it was a big ship. So the ship was doing this and that, and the waves breaking up and so forth. It was, I guess, enough of a storm that you walked around holding on to something. And if I remember correctly, we went to dinner that night, and Bobby and I had the table all to ourselves. So, yeah, that might be a little bit. And, of course, the only other thing I remember about storms at sea, and I'm certainly no sailor, don't know that much about it, but in my early 20s, some men from the company were on one of the smaller fishing vessels and went out to the Gulf Stream, captain and a mate, and 4 to 6 people. Well, a storm came up, and that storm had this boat doing this and that. And we'd go down and pop, and waves come over, and then it would shudder and go back. So everybody was sitting, hanging on. For some reason, I don't think I'm sure I was somewhat scared, but I was not too scared because I was watching the captain, and the captain had a firm hold and kept us heading. He couldn't afford to turn or we'd roll over. He kept facing this way. He was calm as a cucumber, so that helped me a whole lot. I don't know what would have happened if I had seen him scratching his head and beginning to throw some of the fishing gear overboard and so forth. That's the closest. But anyhow, this is a storm. This is a storm that even the captain knows is extremely dangerous. He begins throwing cargo overboard to lighten the ship so that it will come back over the waves. Even some of the extra mast and gear he's throwing overboard. And at the end of verse 20, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. That is a horrible situation when you've given up hope. I know that we're done for. I know that we're goners. That's a situation that we're in here. It even says something about the small boat that's carried in the back. If you're on a cruise ship now, I guess they still do, they call you up near the lifeboats that's nearest to your area, telling you how to get in the lifeboats and so forth. Well, they didn't have that kind of lifeboats, but behind them in tow was a extra small boat. This was even involved. They're trying to bring that on board to secure it. Anyhow, that's a testimony of how bad this situation was. So let's pick it up again in 21. When they had gone a long time without food, food was the furthest thing for their mind. Remember, they'd given up hope. A long time without food. Then Paul stood up in their midst and said, "Men, you ought to have followed my advice to have set and not to have set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and loss. Yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood before me, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I've been told. But we must run aground on a certain island.'" Here's Paul's prediction. Actually, it's a prediction because of the vision he's had of an angel. I don't know whether it's a physical angel stood before him and verbally spoke to him, whether it was a dream or whatever, but it was very real to Paul. An angel of God has stood before me, and he said, "You're going to get to Rome. You're going to lose the ship, but you're going to get to Rome." Paul believed that, and he's trying to convey that trust and belief to the sailors with him. In the midst, excuse me, in the midst of his prediction and so forth, notice in verse 23, he also throws in a little bit of a testimony. He says, "The angel of God stood before me," and he's talking about God, the God to whom I belong. I belong to God. I'm in His hands. He is in control. He is my God. I belong to Him. Whom I serve. You notice that many of the letters Paul wrote, he said, "This is Paul, a servant and even a bondservant of Jesus Christ." So there's a little bit of a testimony. This God to whom I belong and to whom I serve. And then he goes on down in verse 25, I believe God. I trust Him completely. So there's a little bit of a testimony, a prediction. It's a word of encouragement to these people that certainly need encouragement at this point. So he's saying, it's been repeated to me, I'm on a mission. God is sending me to Rome, and I'm going to get there. It'll cost us a lot, but I'm going to get there. Now, let's pick it up again, verse 27. But when the 14th night, by the way, this is not 14 minutes to endure a storm. It's not even 14 hours, half a day enduring a storm, but 14 nights and days came as we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea. About midnight, the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. And they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And a fathom is what? Approximately 6 feet. So 6 times 20, it's about 120 feet. Okay, not too bad yet. And a little farther on, they took another sounding and found it to be 15 fathoms. Whoops. It's getting more shallow quickly. Fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished and hoped for daybreak. But as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's boat, that's the little lifeboat that they had been pulling behind them, but then they had pulled up on the deck. They were letting the ship's boat down into the sea on the pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow. Now this is the staff. These are the sailors. They are concerned. 31. Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, "Unless these men remain on the ship, ye yourselves cannot be saved." Now the soldiers are beginning to listen to Paul. The soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it fall away. They believed Paul. They were without hope. They needed some kind of encouragement. But for 14 days and nights, and it is so bad, even the sailors, or whatever it takes, let us get out of here. Let us save our own necks. 33. Until the day was about to dawn, Paul was encouraging them all to take some food, saying, "Today's the 14th day that you have been constantly watching and going without eating, having taken nothing. Therefore, I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation. For not a hair from the head of any of you will perish." Having said this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. All of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took food. All of us in the ship were 276 persons. When they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat, some of the last part of the groceries, into the sea. That's getting that bad. But notice Paul's influence. Notice his courage. He's encouraging the people. You're weak. You're scared, and of course you hadn't been eating. Go ahead and take some food. Be encouraged. And then let's just finish this up. When day came, they could not recognize the land. In other words, they were not sure where they were. Their navigation charts were useless. They hadn't seen the sun or the stars in days. So they did not recognize where they were, but they did observe a bay with a beach, and they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could. And casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders and hoisting the foresail to the wind. They were heading for the beach. But striking a reef where 2 seas met, they ran the vessel aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern began to be broken up by the force of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none of them would swim away and escape. This would be a normal practice. Soldiers, you're over the prisoners. Anything happens to the prisoners, you pay with your life. 43, but the centurion, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intention and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest should follow, some on planks and others on various things from the ship. And so it happened that they were all brought safely to land. If you had to come up with all of this, and you had one word to put over that one chapter, how would you entitle this chapter? Basically, what I'm seeing is shipwreck. There's a dangerous trip winding up with shipwreck. And who's on the ship? Paul, among others. So let's go back now and look at this just briefly here. I mentioned to you there's several things. Number one, watch Paul through all of this. This is a story of Paul that we're reading here, part of it. So let's look at him for a minute. Number one, it seems like he's the only one who had any courage and encouragement for the crew and the other people. There's in verse 20, all hope was abandoned. This sounds like not only the sailors, the crew, the captain, everybody had given up hope except for Paul. Paul had the courage. He encouraged the rest of them. He was calm, I think. I imagine somewhere along there he might have been a little edgy, but overall he kept his cool through the midst of all this difficulty and so forth. Notice his leadership. He exhibited something as he was going through this trial and so forth that got the attention of the centurion, even the captain, and some of the soldiers. They began to listen to Paul. Paul's got something we don't have. He knows something we don't know. So let's listen to Paul. His influence on the people. And by the way, this is one of the things, this is one of the places where influence, character shows up in the midst of a storm. Excuse me. But if we're talking about shipwreck, as we talked about earlier a while ago, we were talking about people, Christians, facing problems. There is probably in your life some events in your life that you would probably consider a tragedy, something similar to a shipwreck. Maybe it's been loss of a loved one, a broken marriage. There are just so many things, shattered dreams, lost jobs, severe illness, so forth. Somewhere along the way, you have experienced your own shipwreck, tragedy. Maybe you're going through one right now. And I'd hate to be the one to tell you, but if you've never gone through one, hang on tight, you probably will. Shipwreck is something, and tragedy is something that is common. Some of the lessons we can come from that is, number one, being in God's will does not preclude tragedy, tribulation, or shipwrecks. Who would have been closer to the Lord than Paul? And you would think that he would be the very one that would rise above any kind of difficulties, problems, trials. But it is not out of the ordinary. In fact, it is commonplace for Christians to have to go through shipwrecks, tribulation, problems, and so forth. By the way, let me just read that real quickly. In 2 Corinthians, he gets to talking about himself. He says, I don't like to do this, but I'm going to do it. 2 Corinthians 11, verse 23. He's talking about the people are comparing him with other people. He says, I speak as if insane. I'm more so in far more labors and in far more imprisonments. Paul has been in prison so many times, beaten times without number, often in danger of death. 5 times I received the 39 lashes, which is enough to kill some people. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. We read about that. 3 times I was shipwrecked. 3 times. This is not a new experience for Paul. A night and a day I have spent in the deep. Of course, this is 14 days that he's been experiencing this one. So the point being this, just because we're walking with the Lord does not mean that everything's going to be smooth and easy. Secondly, life itself is a dangerous journey. Life itself is a dangerous journey. Jesus tells his disciples in John 16:33, you will have tribulation. This is common. You will have tribulation in this life. Just expect it, be ready for it, and so forth. Another point, as we go through our storms in life, people are watching. People are watching. They will be impacted or influenced on how we take our difficulties. It's not so much a matter that we're undergoing them, but what is our response to them? And be careful, people are watching to see how we go through these things. Another point, storms bring out true character. True character. On smooth seas, when everything is going smooth, everybody looks like they got everything under control. Everybody can put on a happy face. They can be the biggest hypocrite in the world, and nobody will know the difference because everything is going smooth and everything is going right. However, watch what happens when somebody goes through the dark places. That's where you'll see true character brought out. Who are they really? This will actually bring them about. Another point. When we go through these trials, and I'm not saying this is true all the time, but it could be that it's a matter of spiritual warfare. Satan might be trying to derail us. For instance, Satan in this storm here, Satan knew that Paul was on his way to Rome. Where was Rome? Not some little small town where he would do some preaching, but this was the headquarters of the whole Roman Empire. This is the place of influence. Satan certainly would not want Paul to be witnessing there. This is the center of some of the worst evil you can imagine. These were the days, and I don't know the exact timing here, but these were the days when Nero was just rising to power. And you remember Nero and what he did, maybe not at the beginning of his administration, but later. He's the one that built the big Colosseum, put Christians in the midst of it, just as part of it. Brought Christians in, put them in the Colosseum, had wild animals, lions, tigers, and so forth. Didn't feed them for days. Had the Christians wrapped in animal skins, put out in the arena, and then cut those animals loose. Nero, he's the one that poured tar over some Christians and then struck a match and used them for torches. Sounds really grotesque. It's gruesome. You don't want to talk about it. This is how far evil can go when unchecked. But Satan knew that Paul is on his way to Nero's headquarters, for instance. So he would have had an interest in keeping him from it. Another thing to keep in mind, God is sovereign. God has a plan. God has already said, Paul, you're going to Rome. He didn't say on a jetliner in first class service. All he said is, I'm going to get you to Rome. He didn't mention what was going to take place getting him to Rome. But the fact of the man, the thing is, God has a plan and a purpose for the storms. He's sovereign. He's still in control, even when it looks like he's not. Another thing, there's lessons to be learned in storms, lessons you probably wouldn't learn in smooth waters. There are things that happen in storms that can increase your faith. It doesn't take too much faith to believe and have a strong or a good, healthy faith when everything is going smooth. The income is coming in, you're healthy as can be, your family's safe. That doesn't take much. But faith, when it is tried through a storm, comes out in different measure. This is a different kind of faith. God has brought me through many storms. I have the utmost faith that He'll bring me through this one. If you remember back in Matthew 14:22, It's a story, you probably remember it. Jesus with his disciples had been ministering across the Sea of Galilee. So nightfall is coming on, and he puts the disciples in a boat and says, I'll meet you on the other side. But Jesus doesn't get in the boat. He goes away and prays. The middle of the night, a storm has come up, and the disciples, many of them were fishermen. In other words, they were experienced sailors, were scared to death. They were getting nowhere. The sails were useless. They couldn't row. They were getting nowhere. It was a horrible situation. And you remember what happened? They saw Jesus walking on the water. But back up a little bit. Do you remember when the disciples got in the boat? Jesus put them in the boat. Said, get in the boat. I'll meet you on the other side. He forgot to tell, well, he didn't forget either. He didn't tell them there's going to be a big storm, and you're in for a wild ride that's going to scare you to death. He didn't say those things, but he did instigate the trip into a storm so that the disciples could look on this later as an increase in faith. The one who put them in there could also keep them. One last thing here, not one last, these are just some little things. Maybe you can think of more things as you look back on this chapter. But how do we respond to our storms? Do we trust him? Do we know that he's sovereign? He could have prevented the storm if he wanted to. It is, if it's not of his making, it is of his permission. He knows we're going through a storm. Can we trust him? He's in control. Trust him. Keep this in mind. God does not promise us smooth sailing. He does promise us a safe landing. He does promise us a home in glory. He doesn't say it's going to be such a sweet, smooth trip. So how do we respond? We respond knowing that he's in control, and we will have a safe landing. And then let's remember too, as we've already mentioned, people are watching us. We have a lot more influence on people when they see us going through the hard places and how we take it, whether our trust is in God, as opposed to the smooth sailing where everybody can put on the best front possible. So this is the difference that we have in it. And then let's remember too that whatever we're going through, Jesus has given us his promise. My grace is sufficient. He says, in this world you will have tribulation, but my grace will see you through it. I think there's a lot more here. It sounds at first like it's just another biography, a part of the lesson that we learn about Paul and his activities, but I think there's some real spiritual lessons for us today as we go through whatever storms we may. And I'm looking at you, and I know something about some of you, and I know that some of you have been through storms, some of you are going through storms. All of us will have that in our background, going through storms. It's not what happens to us, it's how we take what happens to us or how we respond. Amen? Now may that peace, which passes all understanding, guard our hearts and our minds in and through Christ Jesus. Amen? There's handouts on the side. That'll be the last ones for Acts.